President Xi Jinping of China is currently visiting Europe, and he plans to visit Serbia shortly in the next day or so, and there commemorate the 25th anniversary, sad anniversary, of the NATO bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade as part of its roughly 90-day bombing of Serbia in 1999. Now, these events have been commemorated several times over the last short period of time, but this visit is a very significant event and one that I was reflecting upon because the NATO bombing of Serbia was defended as a war for civilization, and we hear similar rhetoric today. Wars to defend Western civilization, wars to defend the garden of Europe against the horde of Eurasia or the people who live in the jungle of the rest of the world. Regrettable rhetoric from the European Foreign Minister Josep Borrell. But it is particularly the bombing of Serbia in 1999 that has been a very significant event in China's understanding, as shown here by its President Xi's visit to Serbia, its understanding of itself in the world, but also Russia's understanding of itself in the world. But not only that, it was a very significant event in world history, in the history of the Atlantic Alliance, of the West's concept of itself as Western civilization. And I'm currently delivering a course on the history of civilizations that looks at a book by Felipe Fernandez, Amesto, Civilizations. In this course, we read along with me reading this important book that gives you a sort of a world tour of the history of the world from all across the world, all the different civilizations of the world. And the final section, it looks at how civilizations have adapted to environments, and it looks at how Atlantic civilization emerged as an adaptation of the environments and ultimately became the globe-spanning civilization of the West, of the Atlantic Alliance, of NATO. And it is a very interesting and extremely prescient reflection, and I will read it to you in a moment. But let me contrast it first to how, for example, elite opinion in the West, as represented by the Economist magazine, is presenting President Xi's noting of this event. They have a headline here: visiting Europe as Xi Jinping brings up an old grievance. In marking the bombing of China's embassy in Belgrade, Mr. Xi is sending a message to America. They go on and say, Xi's visiting Serbia, even though it's barely a third of the population of Beijing. They say Serbia is a rare close friend on a continent where wariness of China has become the norm. It also happens that the country's capital, Belgrade, witnessed a seminal moment in the evolution of West despising Chinese nationalism. 25 years ago, American bombs hit the Chinese embassy there, killing 3 people. On his first visit to Europe since 2019, Mr. Xi has been holding talks with Emmanuel Macron, hoping to persuade him and his allies that China and its high-tech products are good for them. On May 7th and 8th in Serbia, Mr. Xi will use the anniversary of the bombing to make another point, that the Western-led order is bad and must be changed. So the Economist is seeking to frame this event in sort of goody and baddie language, and really to demonize what is clearly bombing an embassy is of a non-combatant nation in another country is really, well, it's certainly not a particularly And it's not a particularly good evidence that the Western-led order is rules-based or even liberal and good. And it's a huge contrast to what Felipe Fernandez Amesto says in his book on civilizations about this event. I am recording this class in the week when we're noting the 25th anniversary of that event. And I just want to read for you because I think it's highly relevant to this theme and highly relevant to events of today. Just point out to you the prescience of this section on page 535 to 536 of Felipe Fernandez book, Civilizations, in the chapter The Atlantic and After, where he notes, in the end, America beat the Soviet Union in what was in effect a competition in spending power, because only a capitalist economy could afford guns and butter. Meanwhile, however, America never felt secure enough to revert to isolation. The fortress in which the West withstood communism was sustained by the pillars of the Atlantic Alliance. Western Europeans grumblingly accepted in their own interests a role for most of their territory as America's first line of defense, scattered with American bases, bristling with American weapons. Atlantic civilization huddled around the ocean for its defense. The last great age of Atlantic solidarity may appear in hindsight as a response to self-perceived weakness. The collapse of Soviet power did not at first weaken the Atlantic system, though it will surely do so in the long run, since without a common threat, Europe and America will cease to have common interests. Now, instead of needing them as allies against communism, America wanted the Europeans as partners in global policing. From the last years of the 20th century, as America's share of the world economy shrank, the costs of global peacekeeping soared. A world safe for democracy now had to be defended against the terrorism of irrational cults and factions and the menace of rogue states under unpredictable dictators like Iraq of Saddam Hussein and the Serbia of Slobodan Milosevic. And here we're coming to the Serbian events. Public opinion demanded increasing intervention on behalf of human rights and ecological propriety. Just war theory had to be extended to the point of distortion to justify a new role for the Atlantic Alliance as a humanitarian warrior, or jumping forward 25 years as, Asian NATO. Bombing people into compliance with a moral menu, essentially unchanged since Woodrow Wilson involved America with the world. Self-determination, democratic forms, non-aggression. Towards the end of the 20th century, Euro-American cooperation still looked deceptively impressive. The bombing power of NATO helped to enforce two radical new departures in the politics of Southeast Europe. First, the effective partition of Bosnia into three bloodily butchered cuts, one for each of the main contenders in a civil war. More bombs were then used to force Serbia to concede supremacy in Kosovo to secessionist fighters. To some extent, these operations, dubious in their morals, equivocal in their effects, locked the United States and her European allies into an open-ended commitment to work together. The peacekeeping forces they installed in the region would be stuck there indefinitely, like field hospital sutures. They were makeshift staunches of blood which could not easily be withdrawn. On the other hand, the operations were so mismanaged and so counterproductive that they made the Europeans and Americans mutually wary and recriminatory. The Kosovo operation exacerbated the war, accelerated massacres, and rewarded terrorists. It left a legacy of resentment among the innocent victims of NATO bombing in Serbia and Montenegro. One might add also in China, because the Chinese embassy, as Xi Jinping is about to acknowledge, was bombed in 1999, and a $100 billion cleanup bill. Though NATO propaganda tried to justify it as a war for civilization, it was really undertaken to save face. And here he quotes I think it's an American advisor. Let me just double check. He quotes Misha Glenny's book, The Balkans, Nationalism, War, and the Great Powers. If NATO backed down, it would lose its vaunted credibility. It had announced the bombing, and so it must go ahead regardless of the consequences. The Pentagon, however, advised against. So did European diplomats involved in Balkan affairs. The reply came back: credibility. One might add also, Joe Biden, the current president of the United States of America, was an ardent advocate of that bombing of Serbia. And then Felipe Fernandez has this powerful concluding statement. When the Atlantic Alliance finally breaks down and Western civilization is split by political schism, this thoughtless warmongering may be seen as one of the acts which deservedly condemned it, exposing its flaws, undermining its civilized credentials. So I think Felipe Fernandez Amesto's account of this event really gives us a much more significant and profound understanding of these events. And the question really is, as some of the rhetoric for scaling up the war of civilization against Eurasia gets more and more dangerous by the day, whether we should not reflect on Felipe Fernandez Amesto's words, whether we need to take a step back and think more deeply about the grave consequences of NATO's bombing of Serbia in 1999, and whether the West should not take a different path in its conduct of peace diplomacy and rather less war with the rest of the world. I hope you've enjoyed this little reflection on history and current events, world history and current events. I try to help you see the world more clearly with history on this channel, and you can check out my writing on jeffrich.substack.com, my courses on world history and geopolitics at courses.jeffrichwriter.com, and make sure you like, share, and subscribe, and look at ways so you can support me in the links in the video description. Okay, bye now.